You can pray every day and still block your own prayer without realizing it, not because you don't believe, not because you don't try, but because of something you say automatically, something you've repeated so many times it feels right, even though Scripture warns against it. Not loudly, not in a way most people notice, but clearly enough that once you see it, you can't ignore it again, because prayer is not just speaking, it's alignment. And words that break that alignment don't just sound wrong, they change what your prayer becomes. And here's the uncomfortable part. You've probably said at least one of them this week, maybe even today. Not intentionally, not rebelliously, just habit. But habit doesn't make it harmless. It makes it invisible, and invisible mistakes are the ones people repeat the longest. Now listen carefully, because this isn't about fear. It's about precision. Scripture doesn't say, pray however you feel. It shows patterns. It corrects language. It draws lines. And those lines exist for a reason, not to restrict you, but to keep you from saying something that contradicts what you're asking for. Because when your words contradict your prayer, you're not asking anymore. You're canceling it. And that's where the first mistake begins. The first word you need to remove from your prayer sounds humble, but it actually reveals doubt the moment you say it. If, as in, God, if you are listening, or if you can, or if it's possible, and it feels careful, respectful. But listen to what Scripture says, and whatever you ask in prayer, believing, you will receive. Matthew 21, verse 22, believing. Not guessing, not testing, not adding conditions that question whether God is able or present. Because the moment you say, if, in that way, you're not expressing humility, you're expressing uncertainty about the one you're praying to. Now don't misunderstand this, because people try to justify it. I'm just being honest. I don't want to assume. But look at how Jesus responds when if is used this way. If you can do anything, have compassion on us. And Jesus said to him, if you can, all things are possible for one who believes. Mark 9, verses 22 to 23. He doesn't ignore the word, he corrects it, because the issue is not the request, it's the doubt hidden inside the wording. Now think about your own prayer for a second. How many times have you said if without noticing what it implies? Not once. Repeatedly, and repetition builds patterns, and patterns shape how you approach God. That's why this matters, because it's not just one word, it's what that word reveals about your expectation. Now here's the shift. There is a difference between surrender and doubt. Saying, your will be done, is not the same as saying, if you can. One trusts, the other questions, ability. And Scripture never teaches you to question God's ability, only to trust His will. That's why Jesus prays, nevertheless, not my will, but yours be done. Luke 22, verse 42, not if you can. That distinction matters more than most people realize. And once you see it, you can't say it the same way again. And what comes next is even more subtle, because the second word doesn't sound like doubt at all. It sounds polite, respectful, even spiritual. But it quietly weakens everything you just asked for without you noticing it. And this is where it gets more subtle, because the second word doesn't sound like doubt. It sounds respectful, almost spiritual, the kind of word people add at the end of a prayer without even thinking about it, as if it makes the prayer safer, maybe. As in, maybe you will help me, or maybe this will change, or maybe this is your will. It feels careful. It feels like you're leaving space. But listen to what that word actually does. It removes expectation. And once expectation is removed, prayer becomes uncertainty instead of faith. Scripture is direct about this. But let him ask in faith with no doubting, for the one who doubts is like a wave of the sea that is driven and tossed by the wind. James 1, verse 6. Not partially believing, not hoping it might happen, asking in faith, because faith is not guessing, It's trusting what you cannot see without weakening it with hesitation. Now think about how often maybe slips into your thinking, even if you don't say it out loud every time. You pray, and then you tell yourself, maybe it will happen. You ask, and then you prepare yourself for it not to. And that shift, that quiet adjustment, changes the entire posture of your prayer. Because you're no longer standing in expectation, you're standing in uncertainty. Now here's where people misunderstand this, because they think faith means forcing an outcome. It doesn't. Faith is not controlling what happens, it's trusting who God is. That's why Scripture doesn't tell you to predict the result. It tells you to ask without doubting. There's a difference. You're not declaring what must happen. You're refusing to weaken your trust with words that cancel it the moment you speak them. Now listen to this carefully. Therefore I tell you, whatever you ask in prayer, believe that you have received it, and it will be yours. Mark 11, verse 24. Believe. Not maybe, not we'll see. Believe. Because the moment you reduce belief to possibility, you've already stepped out of the position Scripture describes. Now stop and think honestly. How many times have you prayed and then immediately softened it with maybe in your mind? Not because you didn't want to believe, but because you didn't want to be disappointed. That's where this word hides. It protects you emotionally, but it weakens you spiritually. Because instead of standing firmly in trust, you create a middle ground when nothing is certain. And Scripture never builds prayer on uncertainty. It builds it on faith and surrender, not hesitation. Now here's the important distinction you can't miss. Faith does not mean you control the outcome, but it does mean you trust without dividing your own words. You don't say one thing in prayer and another thing in your thoughts right after. That contradiction breaks alignment. And alignment is what gives prayer clarity. Now imagine this clearly. You pray with conviction, with focus, with intention, and then seconds later you think, maybe nothing will change. That second thought doesn't just sit there. It cancels the first one, not because God is confused, but because your own posture shifted. And posture matters, because prayer is not just what you say, it's how you stand internally when you say it. Now this is where most people get stuck, because they don't notice how often they divide their own prayer. Words of faith, followed by thoughts of doubt. And over time, that pattern becomes normal. And when it becomes normal, you stop expecting anything at all. You just repeat the process, and repetition without expectation leads to empty routine. That's not what Scripture describes as prayer. Now listen carefully. You don't need to pretend certainty about outcomes, but you do need to remove hesitation from your trust, because trust that is constantly weakened by maybe never stabilizes. It never stands. It keeps shifting. And anything that keeps shifting never builds confidence in your relationship with God. Now here's where it becomes real. The next time you pray, notice what happens right after. Not during, after. What do you say to yourself? What word do you allow to follow what you just asked for? Because that's where the second mistake actually lives. Not always in the spoken prayer, but in what you quietly add to it the moment it ends. And if that word is maybe, then you've already weakened what you just asked for without even realizing it. And what comes next is even more direct, because the third word doesn't sound like doubt or hesitation at all. It sounds final, it sounds decisive, but it closes something that should never be closed that way. And this is where it becomes the most dangerous, because the third word doesn't sound weak, it sounds strong, final, almost responsible. And that's exactly why people never question it. Never. As in, this will never change. I'll never get through this. Things will never be different. And you might say, that's not part of prayer. That's just how I feel. But listen carefully. What you say after you pray is still shaping what you prayed, because your words don't stop having effect just because you changed the moment. They carry forward. And if what you say after prayer contradicts what you asked in prayer. You've created a division that Scripture warns about. A double-minded man is unstable in all his ways. James 1, verse 8. Not because he prays wrong once, but because he says one thing and then reinforces the opposite. Now think about this honestly. You ask for change and then you say, it will never happen. You ask for strength and then you say, I'll never get through this. You ask for peace and then you repeat, this will never end. That word, never, sounds like realism, like you're being honest about your situation. But in reality, you're making a declaration that closes the door you just asked God to open. And Scripture never teaches you to seal your situation with finality like that. It teaches the opposite. With God, all things are possible. Matthew 19, verse 26. Not some things, not things that look likely. All things. That doesn't mean everything happens the way you expect, but it means you don't get to declare impossibility over something you just brought before God. Now here's where people push back. I'm just expressing how I feel. And that's true, but expressing a feeling repeatedly turns it into a statement, and statements shape belief, and belief shapes expectation. That's why Proverbs says, death and life are in the power of the tongue. Proverbs 18, verse 21. Not because words are magical, but because they reinforce direction. If you keep saying never, you train yourself to expect nothing to change. And expectation affects how you pray, how you act, how you respond. It closes you off before anything shifts. Now imagine this clearly. You kneel, you pray, you ask sincerely, and then you stand up and say, this will never work. Do you see the contradiction? Not subtle, direct. And that contradiction is what creates instability, not in God, in you. Because you're moving in two directions at once, asking for one outcome while declaring another. Now here's the key point you can't miss. Scripture does not tell you to deny reality. It tells you not to declare finality over what God has not finished. There's a difference. You can say, this is hard. You can say, I don't understand. You can say, this hurts. That's honesty. But saying never takes it further. It closes the future as if you already know the outcome. And that's a position you were never given. Now stop and think about how often that word appears in your daily speech. Not once, repeatedly, especially after you pray, especially when nothing changes immediately. That's when it slips in, quietly. And over time, it becomes your default response. And once it becomes your default, it shapes everything that follows. Now listen carefully. Prayer is not just what you say in that moment. It's what you continue to say after it, because consistency matters, alignment matters. And if your words outside of prayer undo what you said inside of it, you're not building anything stable. You're canceling it piece by piece. Now here's where this becomes real. The next time you feel the urge to say never, pause. Not to pretend everything is fine, but to stop yourself from closing something that is not yours to close. Replace finality with trust, not forced positivity, trust. Because there is a difference between acknowledging difficulty and declaring impossibility. And Scripture never asks you to declare impossibility. And Scripture never asks you to declare impossibility. Now this is where everything connects, because these three words, if, maybe, and never, they don't look dangerous on the surface. They sound normal. They sound human. But used the wrong way, they create doubt, hesitation, and finality that break the alignment of prayer. And what comes next is where this stops being information and becomes a decision you make every time you speak. And now it stops being about which words you heard and becomes about what you actually do the next time you pray. Because awareness without change doesn't correct anything. It just makes you more conscious of the same mistake. And this is where most people quietly fail, not because they reject what Scripture says, but because they don't adjust how they speak when the moment comes again. They hear it, they agree with it, and then they repeat the same pattern the next day as if nothing changed. That's why this part matters more than everything before it, because prayer is not built on intention alone, it's built on alignment. What you believe, what you say, and what you continue to say after you pray must move in the same direction, or you divide yourself. And divided words create unstable prayer. Scripture makes this clear, not abstractly, but directly. Let your yes be yes, and your no, no. Anything more than this comes from evil. Matthew 5, verse 37. Not because extra words are always wrong, but because unclear, shifting speech reveals a divided position, saying one thing and reinforcing another, asking in faith and then weakening it with hesitation or finality. That's the pattern that has to stop. Now think about how this actually plays out in real life. You pray for guidance, and then you say, if it even matters. You pray for help, and then you say, maybe it won't change anything. You pray for breakthrough, and then you say, this will never be different. That sequence happens fast, almost automatically. And because it feels normal, you don't notice how directly it contradicts what you just asked for. But contradiction doesn't need to be loud to be effective. It just needs to be repeated. And repetition is what builds your default way of speaking. Now, here's where it becomes practical, because this is not about trying to sound perfect. It's about removing the words that break alignment. You don't need complicated language. You don't need long prayers. Scripture doesn't reward length, it corrects posture. When you pray, do not heap up empty phrases, for your Father knows what you need before you ask Him. Matthew 6, verses 7 to 8. That means clarity matters more than volume. Precision matters more than repetition. And removing 3 words can change more than adding 10 sentences. Now imagine this clearly. You begin to pray, and instead of adding if, you speak with trust. You are able. Instead of allowing maybe to follow, you remain steady. I trust you. Instead of closing your situation with never, you leave it open. Nothing is impossible with you. That's not performance. That's alignment. And alignment is what Scripture points to again and again. Not perfect wording, consistent direction. Now here's the uncomfortable part most people avoid. This requires attention. You can't stay on autopilot, because autopilot is where these words live. Habit, repetition, familiar phrases you said for years without thinking about them. And breaking that pattern feels unnatural at first. It feels like you're slowing down something that used to flow automatically. But that's exactly what correction looks like in the beginning. Not smooth, intentional. Now ask yourself something honestly. What happens right after you finish praying? Not during. After. What do you say out loud? What do you say internally? Because that's where most of the damage happens. Not in the prayer itself, but in what follows it. And if what follows contradicts what you asked, then nothing stabilizes. It keeps shifting. Now listen carefully. This is not about controlling outcomes. It's about removing contradiction. Because Scripture never asks you to guarantee results. It asks you to trust without dividing your own words. That's the standard. And once you see that clearly, the responsibility shifts. It's no longer about what God is doing, it's about what you are saying, and what you are repeating, and what you are reinforcing every day without noticing it. And what comes next is where this becomes a decision, not a concept. Because the next time you speak, you will either repeat the same pattern, or you will break it on purpose. And this is the moment where everything becomes real, because you don't need another explanation, you need a different response the next time the words are about to come out of your mouth, and that moment will happen sooner than you think. Not in some distant situation. Today, in a quiet moment, in the same place you've prayed before, and nothing around you will look different, which is exactly why most people fall back into the same pattern without even noticing it. They don't reject truth, they just don't change what they say. And because they don't change what they say, nothing actually changes. Now stop and think about this clearly. The next time you begin to pray, The first few words will come automatically. Habit, familiar phrases, the same structure you've used for years, and in that moment, you'll have a choice you didn't have before. Not because something external changed, but because you're aware of what those words actually do. And awareness removes the excuse of "I didn't know." Now you know. Now you hear it as you say it. And that's where the decision happens, not later, in that exact moment. Now imagine this clearly. You start to pray, and the word "if" rises without you even planning it. That's the old pattern, and instead of letting it pass through automatically, you stop. Just for a second, you correct it. Not perfectly, intentionally. You don't say, "if you can." You say, "you are able." That one change may seem small, but it shifts your entire posture from uncertainty to trust. And posture matters because prayer is not just words, it's direction. Now, the second moment comes, right after you finish. The thought appears, maybe nothing will happen. That's the pattern you've repeated before, and again you pause. You don't let it complete the sentence, you replace it, not with forced certainty about outcomes, but with steady trust. "I trust you." That keeps your words aligned instead of divided, and alignment is what stabilizes your prayer over time. Now, the third moment, the one that usually comes later, when nothing changes immediately. Frustration, delay, and the word "never" tries to close everything. This will never be different. That's where most people undo everything. Not in prayer, after it. And again, you stop. Not to deny what you feel, but to refuse to declare finality over something God has not finished. You say, "Nothing is impossible with you." Matthew 19, verse 26. Not as a formula, as a correction. Because that's what Scripture does. It replaces what closes you off with what keeps you open to what God can do beyond what you see. Now listen carefully. This is not about becoming perfect overnight. You will catch yourself mid-sentence. You will notice it after you've already said it. That's part of breaking a pattern that has been automatic for a long time. But every time you notice it and correct it, you weaken the old pattern and strengthen a new one. That's how change actually happens. Not instantly, repeatedly. And Scripture points to this kind of steady correction, not sudden perfection. Be transformed by the renewal of your mind. Romans 12, verse 2. Renewal is a process. It happens through repeated choices that move in the same direction. Now, here's the part most people won't accept, because it removes every remaining excuse. If you keep saying the same words the same way after knowing what they do, then you're choosing the pattern. Not accidentally, intentionally. Because awareness always brings responsibility. And once you hear it clearly, ignoring it becomes a decision, not a mistake. Now, don't overcomplicate this. You don't need longer prayers. You don't need better phrases. You need alignment. Remove what creates doubt. Remove what creates hesitation. Remove what creates finality. Keep what builds trust. Keep what reflects what Scripture actually teaches about prayer. That's it. And if you do that consistently, even in small moments, something shifts. Not because you control the outcome, but because you stop dividing your own words. And once your words move in one direction, your prayer becomes clear instead of conflicted. And clarity is what most people have been missing without realizing it. So the next time you pray, don't focus on saying more. Focus on not undoing what you just said. Because the difference between a repeated routine and a living prayer is often just 3 words. And whether you choose to keep saying them or not,